How many people have seen the movie? Probably most of you. Well, I also hope that most of you realize that anytime Hollywood does a real-life story, they have, they're unable to resist fixing it up a little. You know what I mean? They think they can always improve on real life. And in some cases that's true, but I think in the case of certain parts of the movie that they strayed from what actually happened to such an extent that I've been trying to get a remake of the movie done to tell it more like it really happened. Get the volume down a little bit. This has got some echo to it. Before I get going here, I just want to, because I'll probably forget later on, there are a couple of dates to mark on your calendar. November 10th, the Discovery Channel will be airing a show I did in England with an English pop star named Sean Ryder, and he's the host of a show called Sean Ryder on UFOs. And so that'll be airing November 10th. And then on November 3rd, I did an episode with Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Okay, go ahead and laugh. Anyway, when they called me up, I thought, what? You know, what for? But apparently the younger girls had a sighting and wanted to, know more about it. So we did a little tour up at Area 51, and so I'll let you watch the show. But I'd never seen it before, and I just went along with it because I wanted to meet Bruce Jenner, and so it was pretty interesting.
What day is that?
That's November 3rd. Okay. It's kind of ironic because this happened on November 5th, 1975. It was a Wednesday. Unlike in the movie, rather than there being 5 of us out there was 7 of us. And we put in a long, hard day. And so we're heading home. It was starting to get dark. In the movie, it makes it look like we'd been driving for so long that we were all sleepy, but we had just recently been working hard physically, and a lot of people don't know, but you guys probably know that Arizona does have a large amount of forest up in the northern part of the state. We all lived in Snowflake, and we drive 30 miles of paved road out to Heber, and then it was another 15 miles of dirt road back up to one of the highest points in that area, up on the Mogollon Rim, 7,000 feet, where the contract was, Turkey Springs. Mike Rogers, the oldest man, he's also the crew boss, upper left. Then Kim Peterson, he was played by Peter Berg in the movie. Alan Dallas was played by Craig Sheffer. Lower left was Dwayne Smith, he wasn't represented in the movie. And John Boulette, the actor they had playing him looked quite a bit like him. And in the lower right is Steve Pierce. He was played by the little boy in the movie E.T., Henry Thomas. Anyway, that was me back then. And we all fit into one truck. In the movie they had it as a Dodge, but getting ahead of myself there. So, we hadn't been driven very far, and, everybody was, really not sleepy, but a lot of real animated conversations going on, not everybody together, but broken up into twos, around the truck, talking about everything under the sun. And so I'm not really sure which one of us caught sight of it first, because it wasn't anything like where you see these little points of light and you immediately become alarmed and saying, what in the heck is that? Because it was just, okay, that's interesting. What's that? And you're looking, and it's just, the farther we go, the more it's just not adding up. I knew it was deer hunting season, so I thought maybe it could be hunters. John was saying that he was thinking, well, maybe it's the moon, but then he sees the moon off to the left, so you know it wasn't the moon. And we had run across forest fires on the way to work because, and you know, stop and put them out because the Mogollon Rim there in Arizona has the highest number of lightning strikes of any place in the United States outside of the Everglades. So, you know, if a tree gets hit by lightning, it don't very often catch on fire. Sometimes it doesn't, it just blows apart. And you pick up a piece of pine wood and it feels like balsa wood. But anyway, so thinking that it might be a fire, that's where the name Fire in the Sky came from. But the road, the dirt track, this little logging trail that we were on, was paralleling the crest of the ridge and was going south up towards the rim road. And the crest of the ridge was to the right. And the light was coming from higher than where ground level would be. So that was the reason I figured it probably wasn't campers or hunters. So, you know, there was a break in the trees, I could tell ahead because the light was shining across the road there. And I said, you know, hurry up, Mike, get up there so we can see what it is. And so there was no hurrying on that road. It was so rough, you know, big boulders in the road. They put these big humps of dirt in there to keep the road from washing out in the rain. But when we finally got to where that light was, there was a clearing, and we suddenly had a clear view of this craft hovering there. And it was probably no farther than from here to the corner back there. It was unmistakable. And our famous UFO skeptic there that was on there, King, was at first tried to say that the crew had actually seen the planet Jupiter. And that's the first thing the skeptics do. They look and see what planet was brightest in the sky. Well, we're talking about a metallic disk that you can see plainly, you know, less than 100 feet away. There was no mistaking it. Alan Dallas yelled out, "It's a flying saucer!" I said, "Mike, stop the truck." And I started opening the door, and when he put on the brake, it made the door swing all the way open. And so I just jumped out and headed towards it. And I was thinking that it would just be gone before I got up close, before it got so dangerous, you know. But the closer I got, the scarier I got, and the more anxious the crew was getting. They were, you know, yelling at me just like in the movie there, you know, swearing and telling me to get back in the truck. And, but I was kind of like sort of committed. I didn't want to show how scared I was. And also, I really did want to see it a little closer. And, you know, I was curious about it. But later in an interview, Alan Dallas was saying it looked to him like I was being controlled, like I was in some kind of trance, like I was being pulled towards it. And Steve's been saying that lately too. But I really didn't feel that way. I felt like this was my own idea. And they say, well, you know, if they're controlling you, they can make you think it's your idea, which is true. But the closer I got, the slower I got. And I could, you know, the sound, most of the sound that I could hear when I first got out of the truck was the higher points, but the closer I got, the more I was aware of this real low, powerful rumble kind of a sound that, you know, the kind that you can feel in your body more than actually hear with your ears. So the highs and the lows were off the range of human hearing on both the high end and the low end. And this was pretty terrifying, you know, but I was trying not to show it. And I got up, and there was a big pile of logging debris that they had placed in the middle of the clearing. The loggers had to clean up some of their slash, and the stuff that we were cutting, you know, would also be burned. And whenever the ground was covered with snow, and that way we would remove all of the burnable material in strips to the forest that would, you know, make it easier to fight a forest fire coming through there. You know, the road itself would contribute to a clearing through the middle of these strips. So that was what we had been working on, and this pile of logging debris sort of halted my approach, and I really didn't want to get in that much closer anyway. And I was standing there looking up at it, and it was just this incredibly imposing, awesome sight. You know, John Gillette says it was like looking at a brand new sports car, just beautiful and terrifying at the same time. But it was glowing in parts and metallic, but it was all smooth as glass. It was like one surface, only parts of it glowed, and it was causing the whole area to just have this real strange sort of look to it. But it was also a strange feel in the air. And, you know, Mike and some of the other crew were saying it seemed like something was about to happen. And I think what they were perceiving right there was a buildup of power, some sort of a charge in the air from this craft. The kind of thing that makes you, you know, the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Maybe this isn't fear, you know, that kind of thing. But Dwayne Smith, the guy that was in the back there, he was 6'7", but he later became a journeyman electrician. And he said, when that beam hit me, it sounded to him like high voltage. And because, you know, he's worked around industrial stuff, and when he says these big knife switches come down, you hear that sound, and that's the way it sounded to him. But in the sheriff's file, one of the deputies had interviewed a crewman who described it as looking like a long blue flame. But when this energy shot out of there like that, I think what happened was the craft had started to move, and it got louder, and it started to rise up, sort of unsteady like. But as soon as that got louder, I was startled, and I jumped down into a crouch. And I got behind this log that was down and in front of me. And they were screaming at me to get the hell out of there, you know. Well, I didn't need to be told. I was thinking, you know, I got to get out of here. And so I stood up to run back, but that was just, you know, another step closer and higher to the craft. And at that moment, I think my head sort of closed the distance between the craft and the ground, and that energy jumped out of there and hit the ground through me. But in the movie, it looks like this spotlight comes on and sort of holds the actor and then just tosses him back. You know, Steve says it threw me back through the air like 20 feet, and my body's tumbling through the air all limp like a rag doll in this ball of energy. And they immediately, you know, didn't just think it killed me, they just knew. They said they were all yelling at each other, "Kill me, you know, get us out of here." And, you know, that's immediately what Mike did. He said he just started the truck back up and just peeled out and just drove like a crazy man through the woods there, tearing the truck up, smashed the mirror, ran into the trees, and tried to get away from there. And when they, you know, the forest was so dense that, you know, they went maybe a quarter mile or so, and they, you know, they stopped and, you know, were trying to think of what to do. And they saw a truckload of hunters go by on the main rim road out there. So they hurried up and went out there and tried to catch those guys, thinking, well, we'll get some guys with guns and we'll go back. You know, because they were already realizing they'd have to go back and see what happened. You see, those guys got a lot of criticism immediately from my family. People were saying that they were cowardly, that this was, oh, some bunch of heroes, they take off and leave their friend there. But they had no reason to stay there and get themselves killed to save somebody that's already dead. They were so convinced that it had killed me. When they stopped that first time before they went after the hunters, Dwayne Smith told the other guys, I think it disintegrated, I think it tore it apart. But Steve says, no, I kept my eyes on him, and when he hit the ground, he was still in one piece. But when they were unable to catch the hunters, and they pulled over, and Mike says, look, this truck's got to go back. And, you know, some of the guys would say, no, let's not go back, let's just go get some help, and we'll get some, you know, some of our friends with guns, and then we can go back. But I said, no, that'd be too late. We've got, you know, we got to do this. But when Mike said, anybody that doesn't want to go with us can wait here, and, you know, and then we'll pick you up when we come back. in the movie, they all got out and waited. In real life, nobody volunteered to wait alone in the dark, you see. So they all got in the truck, and when they went back, they said they saw it take off towards the northeast. So Kenny said he wasn't so afraid about the craft still being there as they were approaching the spot. He said that the thing that scared him the most was what my body might look like, you know, charred or, you know, in pieces or something. So they found the place where the truck had first spun out and dug trenches in the road to take it off. And so they knew they were in the right spot. And I just read recently that they spent about a half an hour looking for me. And as they moved through the trees, they all had one flashlight. They were all trying to huddle around that one flashlight. Steve said he was trying to always make sure he was in the middle of the bunch, you know. They're all shoulder to shoulder, calling and searching. But at one point, Mike broke down, started crying, fell to his knees, and Kenny came over and helped him up, and he kind of got a grip on himself and kind of took charge again. But so they decided to go back to town and report it. And so they argued what to do on the way back. You know, Alan was saying, no, let's not, the cops will never believe us, so we'll just go get some friends with guns, and then if we can't find them, then we'll report it. But, you know, Kenny says, well, look, if Travis is never found, how's it going to look if we don't report it? So, they went ahead and called the local deputy, and you know, Kenny knew that if he just told him about the UFO immediately, the guy might hang up on him and think it was a prank. So he just told him one of our guys missing, and you know, it was real serious. So the deputy came over and met the crew at this service station, which is now derelict, but at the time it was just closed for the night. So they met with the deputy there, and the deputy could immediately tell something really serious had happened, so he called for the sheriff. Sheriff and his chief deputy came down, and you know, a couple of the men were still crying, and they knew something really serious had happened. These guys were shaking, white faces and everything, but the lawmen immediately suspected that this was some kind of wild cover story for a murder. There had been some kind of a fight, probably with chainsaws, and that I was dead out there, and they decided to bury me and cover it up for a while. Nobody was going to see me again. So, unlike in the movie, they did go back that night. Half the crew went on into town in the truck, and three of the others went back with the lawmen. And, you know, even though the lawmen were armed and like that, it still took a lot of courage for these guys to go back there that night. They were unable to find anything at that time, and so the next morning was the biggest part of this 5-day manhunt that went on. They had the local search and rescue team and all of the sheriff's deputies and Forest Service people and civilian volunteers, and it wound up including people on horseback and on four-wheel drives and airplanes and helicopters just crisscrossing the area. Some of the horses were behaving very strangely in the area, and one of them bolted and couldn't be found. But they got the tracking dogs out there finally, and the tracking dogs found a trail from the truck to the middle of the clearing where I'd fallen, and that was the end of it. I found this out quite a bit later, that the relatives of my wife's cousin's wife had been the one that had the tracking dogs. But something else happened during the search. The guys were out there, and they saw this guy, waving this instrument around. They said, "What are you checking for radiation or something?" He goes, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, it sounds like you're detecting radiation." And the guy goes, "No, that's just background radiation. See, 1.5 everywhere here." And so Mike said, "Well, test us." And he waved the thing around on the guys, and he said, "See, still background radiation." Mike said, "Well, we've bathed and showered and changed our clothes." He says, "What about our hard hats?" They went back over to the crew truck and got the hard hats and brought them over there. and he put this Geiger counter up to it, and it swung all the way up to 6. And see, he'd already demonstrated with a radium dial watch that a reading of 3 on a radium dial watch. So when I went up to 6, the guy just kind of stared at him, gave him a sneer, and wrapped up his little instrument and just stomped off and left. And so that was really curious. And Mike had never seen this particular guy around before, even though he's wearing a Forest Service uniform, and somebody he'd never seen. So that was a kind of a funny little episode there that I didn't really ever get to the bottom of. There was also a UFO investigator that came in with these instruments called Gauss meters that measure electromagnetic readings. And they got some high readings right there in the clearing and an actual polarity reversal in the direction that the craft had left. And they, drew it all out and gridded it all out on a map and turned that into the Aero Phenomena Research Organization eventually. But something else was going on during the search. John said that the sheriff sent a deputy with each of the crew members that were out there, and they just pushed at him continually, where'd you hide the body, basically? Come on, maybe somebody, one of the other guys killed him. If you cover up, if Alan killed Travis, and you cover up for it, you're going to be just as liable as him, And we don't have to have the body to convict you of murder. And so they just kept pushing at him, come on, fess up. And at one point, Dwayne Smith was standing back in the clearing, and this Forest Service volunteer walks up and grabs the front of Dwayne Smith's shirt and jerks him up and says, "Come on, where'd you hide the body?" And my brother happened to see that, and he said, "Hey, you knock it off." And my brother was a very imposing sort of figure, and so the guy that dropped him and walked off. But the crew started saying, "Look, we are telling the truth. We did not kill him. We saw what we saw. Give us sodium pentothal, lie detector test, anything you want." Well, that was reported back to the sheriff. So the sheriff said, "We'll take you up on that," and brought in the state police lie detector expert, who was Cy Gilson. You've already seen him in that introductory clip. And so all the men show up for the test, and Alan's mom was kind of feeding this idea that maybe these tests were going to be rigged. The law enforcement wanted it to look like murder, or maybe some government agency was pulling the strings, and it just wanted to cover the whole thing up by making everybody believe it was just a murder and that there was no UFO sighting. So they began to accuse the polygraph examiner and the sheriff of rigging the test. So it was quite an argument there, but they finally, were convinced by the sheriff that it was all going to be fair testing. And so they went in and tested the guys, and sure enough, they passed. And the sheriff was stunned, according to the polygraph examiner, who, when he told him that the men had passed, he just couldn't hardly believe it, because he was totally expecting that these guys had killed me. So that part was over for them, but it still didn't immediately make everything better, because even though the crew for the last 5 days had been subjected to all kinds of accusations from the community, people yelling, "Where'd you hide the body?" Murderer, that kind of stuff. And even, one of my brothers had really seriously threatened the crew, thinking that they had killed me. Now, in the movie, there was one brother named Dan, but there were actually 2 brothers, Don and Dwayne, but they rolled them into Dan. And those are the kinds of simplifications that are, a necessary evil in trying to tell a story that spans 3 years in a matter of 90 minutes. But it's things that happen aboard the craft that are not quite so justifiable. When I first regained consciousness, I couldn't focus my eyes. Everything was blurry. I was just lying on my back. I I didn't know where I was. I didn't even remember the incident. And then, you know, gradually, I was kind of like in and out. I didn't just come completely into consciousness. But then I remembered that approaching that object. But I still didn't get the connection. I thought maybe when I turned to run away, I'd fallen and hit my head on a rock or something, you know, that somehow I'd been hurt and the crew had taken me to the hospital. And yeah, I started to really go with that idea that I was in the hospital because I could tell I was on some kind of a raised operating table or gurney because there was a light fixture above me and the ceiling was just right behind that and it was all closer to me, you know, so I figured I must be on some kind of raised surface. I didn't know at the time that part of the reason that was so close to me was that it was a very small space inside there. But I was having trouble breathing. I just couldn't seem to get enough air. And there was a lot of pain. And there was this thing they had laying across my chest, and I thought this must be part of, you know, medical treatment. It really hurt in my chest and head. I could hear the sounds of movement around me, and I was thinking that that was just doctors. But when I'd move, it hurt worse, so I just tried to hold still. And then, you know, my eyes started to clear. I could see the strange shape of the room and this metallic surface. And I actually had kind of double vision where each image was kind of like that for a little bit. And then when I could finally, you know, get my eyes coordinated, I looked to see what I thought were doctors standing over me. And that's when I saw the face of this creature up close to me. And I just freaked out, I just flipped out. You know, and a lot of people don't understand the level of fear. But you have to understand the situation to understand why the fear, you know, for somebody who had, you know, tried to be fearless, you know, in every other thing in my life, you know, the thing about the bear and all that stupid stuff on my motorcycle, all that kind of stuff, you know. Here, I was out of control of fear, and so many people think, oh, I wouldn't act like that. I would just keep a cool head and ask good questions, take a few souvenirs with me. But you have to understand that, you know, suddenly seeing them so close to me and feeling this pain in this dimly lit, cramped, humid place, but above all, the inability to get enough air. I compare this to the waterboarding thing that they used to interrogate terrorists. Now, the terrorists know about this technique, and even our guys know about it, and they actually do it to themselves to train, to prepare themselves in case they're caught and interrogated by the enemy. But it works anyway, because that feeling of suffocation operates on fear at a very basic instinctive level that you just can't reason away. And it just robs you of the ability to reason the fear away. So I was just out of my mind with fear because I didn't just have the suffocation feeling. I had, you know, the pain, the dim light, the cramped space, and then suddenly seeing this bizarre face so close to me. All of those things just, you know, pushed the fear meter, paid the meter. But in analyzing this later, as soon as I saw him, the shot of adrenaline gave me more strength because you know I could hardly even move. But I tried to hit him away, and I could just barely move my arm enough to push him away. And it was more of a push than a hit, and it fell back into the other one, and it was a lot softer and lighter than I expected. But I rolled away almost at the same time I was hitting it, and that thing fell off onto the floor. And I just kept trying to keep my eyes on them as they were rounding the end of the table coming towards me. So I backed up and I stumbled up against this shelf, a workbench kind of a thing there. And I just glanced real quickly to see what I'd run into. And I saw all these little instruments and things laid out there. So I just grabbed the biggest thing there and swung it around to fend them off. I figured they were coming for me. And so I struck it down on the end of the table, you know, to kind of a threatening motion in itself, but maybe to break the end off and sharpen it, you know. But they were still coming, so I started screaming all these threats and swinging through the air. They were still out of reach, but they stopped. And they stopped and stared. And that was the most, absolutely the worst part of the entire experience. I didn't understand that for a long time. But the three of them standing there, all three staring into me, it had this invasive, intrusive feeling that was, just had this squirmy sort of a feeling in my brain. It was just, it was excruciating. It was horrible. And so that was where my nightmares were, right there. That, again and again for months afterwards, was that stare. And I think I figured out what was going on there. Now, I understand from other reports that they're able to control people, but I think in my case that they were unable to keep me on the table and keep me under control because of that being that had hit me, that it had disturbed the brain activity in a way that disrupted that. So they were all three trying to do it in unison, you know, up the voltage sort of a thing. And that was really horrible. And one thing that, you know, adds to this theory and kind of is what directed me to think of this is that after I was returned, one of the medical tests involved an EEG, a brainwave scan. And this was at Barrows Neurological Institute, a world-famous brain trauma center in Phoenix, Arizona. I was put in there under a false name because there was so much hysteria and media attention and everything that it became impossible to go anywhere. I mean, when I left the hospital, they said, "There he is," and chased us through traffic. So it was necessary to do that. So, but that also served as a way of blinding the technician who didn't know who I was or what had happened to me. He was just told to look for signs of trauma. And in the EEG report, he describes this anomalous brainwave pattern. And that supports my theory that maybe while they were trying to assert this effort through this stare, that it was excruciating because I couldn't receive it, I couldn't be communicated with. And I think once they realized that was the situation, that's the reason they all turned and left the room. Because, you know, even though I was pretty weak, I was so much larger and more powerful than them. And their main weapon was the ability to control people. So, you know, then the table was turned, you know. It's kind of like maybe a tranquilized animal, and the scientists are surprised when it comes out from underneath anesthesia too soon. There's a scene in the movie where the actor is held down on the table. The beings have this membrane stretched over his face, and he's screaming and struggling to breathe through it. And even though that didn't actually happen like that, that actually does a better job of communicating to the audience the feeling of suffocation and helps to, you know, establish the reason why the fear was so completely out of control. So, you know, at first I thought that perhaps just the incredible hysteria was preventing any sort of psychic communication or control. But it's only later, you know, that I figured out that maybe it had something to do with the trauma. But anyway, they left the room, and I figured they might come back at any moment, and the only door there was the one they had left. So there was this little passage that had gone in both directions. They went to the right, so I went to the left. I only figured out what the layout of the ship was later. And I wouldn't have been looking for a way out in the places I was looking if I'd known that I was actually moving towards the center of the ship and not the outside of the ship. And I think that the ship that we saw in the woods was some kind of a scout ship, and I think they have much larger craft for longer distances. I think it could have even been a probe of some kind, like a drone. But, I went looking for a way out, and I was in total panic. I went by right past the door to the left, which probably would have been more likely to have led outside than the one that I finally turned into on the right-hand side farther up. But I was kind of torn in my fear because I didn't know if they were chasing me because the passageway curved so tightly. Couldn't see very far behind me, and I couldn't see very far ahead of me. Because of the tightness of the curve. So I was kind of torn between running or not running, but I just had this urge to just run, and it was just kind of a mindless response to the fear. When I looked into this room, I could see a chair in the middle. I was afraid there could be somebody sitting in it, so I didn't directly approach that chair. I was mainly interested in what I thought were probably doors on the opposite side of the room, with rectangles. But when I entered the room and went up and checked the doors, there was no buttons, no doorknob, no way to open it. So seeing that there was no one in the chair, but also that there were controls in the chair, I thought, well, maybe one of those buttons on the chair would open one of the doors. You know, it's probably a good thing that nothing worked. Because if I had been able to open a door, you know, the assumption I had that I could just drop 15 feet to the ground and be back in the woods was probably not the case at all. Most of the buttons didn't seem to do anything. We didn't have touchscreen in those days at all, so I never even thought about touching the screen. When I moved the lever, well, I'm back up here. When I moved towards the chair, the room would darken. And since I knew at that point that there was nobody else in there, you know, I very quickly realized that the darkening effect had to do with my position in the room. As I scared at first, I stepped back again, and then I could see that, you know, closer to the wall I was, the less bright it was. So I don't know if it was actually darkening, or if it was just had to do with the position of my eye relative to the surface. But whatever it was, there was what I took to be some kind of a star map, like a planetarium, you know, that you see in school, stars that are projected on the wall. Although it might have been an actual way that you could view what was outside the craft at that time, rather than just a map, but maybe it was a viewing of the outside. There was one lever there that moved the star pattern, and all the stars moved at once, which was a very disorienting thing, because that's your main cue to what's vertical. And so I was pretty alarmed by that. I decided I wasn't going to mess with that anymore. A little glimmer of common sense there that I might crash this thing, you know, if this wasn't just control for a planetarium, if it was control for the ship. But then my attention was caught from the door. And I turned, and there was what I took to be somebody there to save me. Some kind of rescue, you know, police, military, NASA, something like that. So I rushed up to him and started asking all these questions and telling him about these creatures that were in there. And he wasn't responding. But I thought maybe it was because of the helmet he was wearing on his head. The helmet was just like a glass bubble. It was either frosted on the back or there was condensation behind his head. But when he didn't respond to my questions, I thought maybe it was because he couldn't hear with that on or be heard with it on. So when he, you know, wanted me to go with him, he was taking me by the arm, I was only too happy to go. You know, somebody that can show me the way out of here. And so he took me on down the hallway through this, what I think was probably an airlock thing, this little piece of hallway that opened on one side and then the other. And when we came out of there, the light was so much brighter and the air was so much cooler. It was almost blinding at first. He took me down this ramp, and I thought, man, I don't want to walk down that thing. I felt very unsteady and very weak. and it was such a steep ramp, but it didn't slip at all. It was, had a real sheer gripping sort of surface. I went down the ramp with him, and I was having to pay attention to where he was. He seemed to be in a hurry, and he's pulling me along pretty quickly. I tried to look around, and I saw probably, I noticed 2 other craft in there that were more rounded and more reflective. But I was mainly concerned with where he was taking me. So he took me out of this room. Now this room was shaped like a quarter of a cylinder on its side. The back wall curved up to become the ceiling. And these were panels of glowing, it was either light fixtures that were giving off something that looked a lot like sunlight, or maybe they were translucent and sunlight was coming through. And so the pathway out of there was this hallway through the vertical wall. He took me down there through some more doors, and there were some people in a room who were dressed like him without the helmets. So he left me with them and left. But that didn't bother me that much. Here was somebody without helmets, maybe they'll answer my questions. So I started with renewed energy to try to get somebody to answer my questions. But instead of talking to me, they started trying to lead me over to this table. And then I was having a whole lot of suspicion that this wasn't a rescue, that I was still in serious trouble. And so I started to resist, because, they weren't answering my questions. But they wanted me to get on the table, and I was fighting them, but I was so weak. And there was 3 of them, and they were so much stronger than me. They got me up on the table, and the woman put this mask over my face. And that extra panic, I was able to jerk one hand free and get it under the edge of the mask and start to pull it away, and then I blacked out, and I just lost consciousness. It didn't hurt, I just blacked out, and I was the end of it. But the next thing I know, I'm waking up with cold air. Now, this conscious period that I just described, I have no idea whether it immediately followed what happened back there with the crew, or if this was later. But I was face down, my head was on my arm, and it was the cold air, and I just came to real clear and quickly. There was a light above, so I looked to see where the light was coming from, but it went off before I could look, but I could still see the shining surface of this craft hovering there, and it just shot up into the sky. It didn't make a sound. It was silent, except for a little bit of warmth and a little bit of brushing, sort of a wind that blew the grass and the tree limbs. And it seemed like it would have had to break the sound barrier at the speed it was going. But maybe the fact that it wasn't lighted and it was night made it seem like it was vanished out of sight faster than it was. But my main concern immediately was this feeling of freedom. I mean, the fact that it was night, that wasn't scaring me, because here I was in the woods and on terra firma, and so that was kind of a relieved feeling. And I looked around and I recognized this stretch of highway, and I got to my feet. I was pretty wobbly at first, but I could see the lights of the town down below, so I just took off running for that. And the main thing that was driving me right there was the memory of those eyes boring into me like that. I got down in the first building I came to that looked like somebody was up. I pounded on the doors and windows, but nobody came. There was steam or smoke coming out of the chimney, and lights were on, but nobody came. it might have been, hearing somebody screaming and pounding on the door in the middle of the night. People thought it might not be a good idea to go to the door. But I continued on down into the town and found some phone booths. I went into the first phone booth and it was out of order. I was on the verge of collapse, and so I didn't have that much strength left, but I went into the next one and it worked. Now, in our part of the country at that time, you could just pick up the phone and talk to the operator without even a quarter or anything. So I called my brother-in-law, and he thought it was a crank call. See, I thought it was still the same night. I thought this was Wednesday, but he says, I think you got the wrong number, real sarcastic, like he thought this was some kind of a practical joke. I didn't know it at the time, but the family had gotten a lot of such calls over the 5 days I was missing. So he started to hang up, but I screamed out, even made him realize it really was me. He says, okay, I'll get your brother and come and get you. And I must have passed out there in that phone booth. The next thing I know, it seemed like almost immediately they were there and picking me up out of there and putting me in the truck. And my brother, I tried to tell him what happened, and it was just so traumatic that I just couldn't get it out. And it was pretty horrible, but he just said, there's no way I'm going to let that mom get a hold of this guy in the shape he's in. But somehow in what was being said there, it came out that so much time had gone by, how worried my mother was over the previous days, and I go, what? And he says, Travis, feel your face. And I felt this 5-day growth of beard. So I immediately looked at my watch. I never even thought to look at it to see what time it was until then. And the date had changed. And that, for some odd reason, was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. I just collapsed and couldn't really talk anymore. But he took me back to the house. I had this really intense emotional reunion with my mother. But he was determined to spare me from what the family had been going through. Continual harassment, the phone ringing constantly. Of course, everybody involved was undergoing the same kinds of things. The sheriff said the phone never stopped ringing. They'd have 2 phones going at the same time. But they were, taking pictures through my mother's window, and Steve said they were taking pictures through his bedroom window, and he lived outside of town. So people stopped looking through the flower beds, and even though the sheriff had requested from the searchers that they keep a lid on the news, it very quickly became worldwide news, and there was already camera crews from Japan and England there, and other countries, and tourists and all kinds of people, and all this steady stream of calls. But it wasn't just prank calls. There was this one lady that called and said that she had been a nurse working in a hospital, and an old couple was brought in that had had an encounter with a UFO, and they were in pretty bad shape. But she said when she came back on shift the next night, the couple was gone, their records were gone, and everybody was insisting, no, this didn't happen, right? So she was saying, just be careful who gets a hold of him should he ever turn up. And another guy called and said he was a retired CIA. And he sounded very serious, left his contact information. It wasn't an anonymous call. And said, just watch out who gets a hold of him. So, there was every good reason, with the madhouse that was going on in the community, for my brother to say nothing to the sheriff, say nothing to anybody, just take me right then in the middle of the night to Phoenix, because he wanted to get me medical help as soon as possible. So that's what he did. He took me down there. He had been contacted during the search by this UFO investigator. Turned out to be a real wacko type group, and that's who's depicted in the movie. And he said that, if he's ever returned, we have medical people that know how to handle this kind of thing. Be sure to get his first voided urine specimen, and we have all this research to do. So, and my brother was very careful to follow the instructions. Took my clothes and put them in a clean bag. and took the urine sample. And we went to this doctor that he sent us to. Turned out the guy was not a doctor at all. It was totally phony baloney. And as he was later investigated, he wasn't even a doctor of anything. You know, he was just some kind of a title he'd given himself. But so once we figured out we were going to get no medical help there, we left, and then we're finally tracked down by the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. My brother had been giving the news media a red herring to follow, telling them that I was in a Tucson hospital. And so a folk singer from New Mexico wrote a song, Why'd They Have to Let Me Out in Tucson, which was total garbled news reports. But that's just an example of how bad the reporting was. They just write anything they could get from anybody, just print it, because nobody's talking, so we'll make it up or whatever. And so some pretty confused reports got out there. But the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization was based in Tucson, and they quickly figured out that I was probably at my brother's house. They said, but look, we've got real doctors in our membership right there in Phoenix. We can have them come and check him out. And so my brother was convinced. He was very anxious about my condition. And so I underwent a whole battery of medical testing right then. Now, the first group were really miffed when my brother said, leave us alone, you're not for real, and, you know, we're not cooperating with you anymore. So because they had already been bragging to the media that they had the case, they tried to pretend that it wasn't us that rejected them, it was them that had rejected us, and they were suddenly attacking the case and claiming that we left because we found out he was a drug expert, and that I was really hallucinating on drugs, and we were afraid he would find out. Well, that's nonsense. For one thing, he was not a drug expert. We looked into his background, and there was just the correspondence going on, a mail-order diploma. And the other thing was, some of my medical tests was to put my blood and urine samples through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, which proved there was no trace of any drug in my body. On top of that, it's been on several of my polygraph tests, was there any drugs involved? And yet, to this day, the skeptics try to use that to cast doubt. And you know, some of these sites that are still putting that information up there, if I go on there and try to post, you know, proof that what they're saying is not true, they won't allow me to post. So just realize, skeptics are not trying to inform the public. They're doing a propaganda job. They don't care about the truth. But anyway, so it was a matter of continually fighting off these kinds of attacks. What existed at that time was there was a multitude of various UFO investigators and organizations, and there was kind of a general rule that if it was your case, it was a good case. If it was their case, then we got questions about it. So even amongst the ufologists, there was kind of this jealousy sort of thing going on, and you know, it was just to some degree to this day. But there was a lot of difficulties with all the theories. There was the theory that I had experienced a transitory psychosis. I could pass a polygraph test because I believed it was true, but I'd really become temporarily insane. Well, so I went through this whole battery of psychiatric tests, which proved to be totally normal in every regard. There was another theory that the hypnotist had planted these memories in my mind, but it was witnessed by a whole bunch of people, including my brother and a couple of medical doctors, a couple of psychiatrists, and there was no leading questions, no planting of ideas at all. But what the media failed to ask on all three of those theories was, how do 7 people have this delusion? Do they all have a transitory psychosis? Do people on drugs all have the same hallucination? You know, and the other guys weren't even hypnotized, so how could the hypnotist have affected their recall of the incident? So it was that kind of difficulty of constantly fighting back against all these theories. So quite a bit of my book is involved in taking each and every charge that the skeptics have leveled against this case and dismissing them and with proof, documentation, there was the theory that the crew got together and decided to make up a story because it would get the boss out of his logging contract. And but there's signed affidavits in the book from the Forest Service contracting people say there's absolutely no way such a claim could have ever had any effect on the contract, and no such claim was ever made. There was no attempt to invoke an active God clause or anything like that. So even though that's disproved, that one keeps getting recycled. And that's just the way the skeptics are. Never mind the facts, you know, anything we can cast doubt. And people that really don't want to believe it, they'll latch on to it. They don't need much convincing. They're looking for something. Over the years, I've gotten thousands and thousands of emails, but every, year or two, I'll get one that's extremely bitter, extremely intense emotionally. But I come to figure out, rather than responding to those kind of people with reason and facts and pointing to the evidence, never mind that. First, convince them not to be scared. And it works. It was amazing how I said, look, this is an extremely rare thing. The chances of it happening to you are a chance in a billion, like holding up 2 4-leaf clovers and being hit by lightning, just don't worry about it. It ain't gonna happen to you. And all of a sudden, then the whole attitude changes, They really are these guys that are just scared and they're living in their mother's basement and they can do nothing but attack people anonymously over the web. But all kinds of, not all of the people who were making claims were against me. Some of them were positive. Like one of my supporters was saying that when I came to that phone booth, the first thing I did was call him. But he wasn't home, so then I called my family. Which is totally absurd. I wouldn't have called him first because I hadn't seen him in, over a year. So the proof in that is that when I made the phone call, it was a collect call. And the operator, against the law, listened in on the phone call and notified the sheriff. The sheriff sent out 2 deputies to dust that place for prints because they knew the call had been made from there to my family. So that was proof that that's where I was. But in spite of that, the same skeptics will claim that I was actually hiding in my mother's house back in Snowflake, 33 miles away. So they try to have it both ways. It's like in that Larry King show, the skeptic was saying that in one breath, he was saying that the ground was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles that should have caught fire and should have burned because of the beam. At the same time, he's claiming the ground was rocky and I hit my shoulder and the doctor should have made note of bruises that I would have from hitting the rocks. So which was it? Was it rocky and it's supposed to bruise me, or was it covered with pine needles and should have caught fire? But, just because it looked like a grenade or looked like a long blue flame doesn't mean it was. Who knows what kind of energy it was? And just the fact that it would accurately hit me rather than the pine needles would explain why it wouldn't light the forest on fire. But again, absence of evidence, absence. So, was it a legitimate, honest motive? There's my brother, my loving brother who protected me. I would not have survived those days. He's passed away since then, a couple of years ago. And I truly would not have made it without his protection. There's L.J. Lorenzen, head of the Aerophenomena Research Organization. And he's the one that called in the real doctors. And on the left there is Dr. James Harder from the University of California at Berkeley. He performed the hypnosis. That was a huge relief for me. And for one thing, the hypnosis was not directed at trying to get at the blocked memories. It was to separate the fear from the memories that I could already recall. And that was successful. And I was able for the first time to relate everything to my family, or my brother who was there, and the rest of the researchers. And then in the middle there is Dr. Leo Sprinkle, head of counseling and testing at the University of Wyoming. And he reviewed all the psychiatric tests that I underwent. And Dr. Gerald Heineck there on the right met with me, said I'd been to the press the next day. He said I'd been the subject of a lot of unfounded accusations. But I'm going to go on here to this Freedom of Information Act document. This is from the FBI files on this famous skeptic, Phil Klass, who was there on the Larry King show. And this was only able to be obtained after he died. It was declassified. You can see the secret is now X'd out. And this is a memo from J. Edgar Hoover. And I found out that the J stands for John. John Edgar Hoover was turning this guy's investigation over to the CIA, the director of the CIA. Now you got to understand that at that time, the FBI and the CIA did almost no cooperating. Before 9/11, and remember after 9/11, everybody was criticizing these agencies because they wouldn't communicate with each other. They were each hogging their little share of the pie and didn't cooperate. But even way back at this time, J. Edgar Hoover was turning it over to the CIA. But even back then, the CIA was much more secret than it is now. Everybody knew FBI, but not that many people knew CIA. But they didn't even put the CIA director's name on the memo. It just says to director of the CIA. But the FBI had been investigating this skeptic for having revealed classified information. And there were several incidences of this. And so these are quotations from the various memos in the file. He was very critical of the FBI for even publishing an article by Jalin Hynek, who was advising the FBI on what to do about UFO reports. He wasn't, making any sort of a judgment about the reality of UFOs. He was just talking about how do you, take the report and what kind of information to ask. The next quotation is, he's well known to us, he's deficient on all points in his arguments, particularly concerning the credentials of Dr. Hynek, which could scarcely be better. On the other hand, Klass has no such sterling reputation and has twice been under FBI investigation. But at that time, it was only twice, but I think there was more investigations than that. Unauthorized publication of classified information, the last quote, his previous communications have generally been accusatory and argumentative in nature. The third quote is, Newark Field Office of the FBI is in possession of a letter Klass mailed to Bell Laboratories. Suggested reading in the letter indicates that Klass is most likely not in full possession of his faculties. So you can see the FBI didn't think too much of it. The next one is Q file, which is an abbreviation for FBI file. Number blah, 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 states, in view of the Klass's intemperate criticisms and often irrational statements he made to support them, it was recommended that the Bureau be most circumspect in any future contacts with him. And this next one is, to me, the smoking gun. From time to time they come to our attention by the virtue of the fact that he has been in, and then they redacted 9 lines. Now, in the past they would always redact by blacking them out, but that looked too covert. They switched to making white boxes. I don't know, maybe they were using way too much toner, because for Freedom of Information Act documents would come out where the whole page was black. So I don't know how much freedom there is in those kind of releases, but there's 9 lines redacted before they say, this Bureau, and here's the key word, and not to be of assistance to his government. So what was the FBI asking him to assist the government about? The bottom one there says, classified information could not be declassified for purposes of prosecution, no action was taken. But the bottom one, SAC, which is not Strategic Air Command, I found that stands for Special Agent in Charge, is maintaining this file in RUC status. And see, this is standard CIA recruiting technique. They get something that they can hold over somebody's head, and then they can kind of control their actions. I do not believe that the FBI turned this guy into a UFO skeptic, but I think they gained a position. Some other government agency was able to gain some leverage to direct his actions, who to focus on, what kinds of techniques. And of course, in exchange, they were bankrolling it because it came to light that he had attempted to bribe one of the crew members, the youngest guy, Steve Pierce, bribed him with a $10,000 offer to claim that the incident was a hoax. Now, this bribe offer was carried, the message was carried by a local deputy. So it was all documented. At the time I published this in 1977, the first edition of my book, and he never took advantage of the opportunity, Mr. Class, of saying, hey, this never happened, right, deputy? I never sent that message, did I? And so he never attempted to do that because the message had been carried. What he did do was take a statement that was printed in another book about this case, where Mike says, well, if Steve would do that, if he would actually take and claim that, even though you know it really happened and would do it just for the money, then you're going to be bruised. Well, Class published that statement, but took out the part, even though you know it really happened, and would do it just for the money. So it made it look like, well, if he takes that offer, then he'll be bruised. And then Class adds the comment, well, it sounds like Mike is threatening Steve to keep him from recanting. But by taking out that, even though you know it really happened and would do it just for the money, he was actually reversing the meaning of the sentence. And this is the kind of sneaky techniques that he's used time and time and time again in attacking this case and many other UFO cases. And, but he actually doesn't attack the case so much as he attacks the person. You know, never mind the facts, let's go after the person. And sometimes these are policemen or priests, you know, it doesn't matter to him, he goes after the person and tries to attack their credibility. And so, the bribe offer, I found out later after Steve resurfaced, he hid from this. He didn't want to be associated with it. He was so terrified by it and so sick of all the accusations and people saying we're crazy that he took off and switched to using his middle name instead of his first name and moved to Texas. But Class tracked him down, flew to Texas, took him out to dinner and pushed and pushed and pushed to try to get him to accept the $10,000 bribe. And Steve went to his wife and he said, you know, I'm thinking about taking the money. And she said to him, well, you say it really happened, right? He goes, oh yeah, it happened, I just want the money. And she said, well, you know, you don't be doing that. If it happened, then don't be saying it didn't. So he didn't take the money, and he moved from Texas to Utah, and then he was followed there by Class, you know? So as soon as Steve heard about that, he took off and left again, and then he wound up in Montana, but he was being pursued. And none of this stuff was ever printed. He printed and attacked this case in parts of several books, and he kept these sheaf of papers that he kept mailing out to all the media, making all these claims. It's the kind of thing where he's real selective about what he does. Called all the bars in town, looking for bad stories about me. When they said, he never comes in here, he hides that fact. He goes to former employers. No, he's a great guy. Not going to say a word about that. He's looking for dirt, and that's all he's going to report. So to his readers, it makes it look like he's uncovered some real horrible stuff, when what he's really finding is stuff quite to the contrary. He found all kinds of good stuff about my mother, you know, that she was voted Woman of the Year and nominated another year for her work with the Senior Citizen Center and causes there in town. But he keeps quiet about all that kind of stuff. Everything that good was ever said about Kim Peterson, you know, it was very selective reporting. So, but the point I'm trying to make here is some things that add to the idea that this was some kind of a covert operation in actuality, because, for instance, I attacked him for being an armchair investigator, doing everything on the phone, call up, get some quotations, then tweak the way, you know, cherry pick what's said, and then publish that. Never doing anything in person, like Stan Friedman came to my house, came to the site, investigated personally. APRO came to the site, investigated. I met with Heineck, you know, all these people that did in-person investigations, hands-on, research, and I was criticizing him for never having done that. He never responded to that criticism. But I found out here a couple of years ago at the IUFOC in Scottsdale, this guy came up and was apologetic that he had picked class up at the airport and driven him up to the site. Now, why in all those writings did he never make any mention of having done these things, these expensive trips? You know, there's no way that the sales of his little anti-UFO books could ever justify $10,000 bribe. So I think that had to do with being bankrolled by this agency. But there's more to that. Right before the Larry King show, I was received a phone call from a guy that said that he had been in the area at the time, deer hunting, that he had actually been on the other ridge. It was a remote area. You'd have to know the area to describe the terrain the way he did. So I knew he was telling the truth about having been there. He said he was deer hunting. He was with his wife, from whom he's now divorced, but she would still vouch that they were there, saw the glow of the craft, saw the flash of the beam, and so I thought that was really interesting, and I called Tracy Tormey up and told him about this guy, gave him the contact info, never gave it another thought. I found out much later that Paramount had flown this guy out to Hollywood, interviewed him, and decided to give him a polygraph test because, you know, it was cool that he here was an independent witness. Well, one of the things that impressed me about his credentials is that he was in military intelligence at the time. And rather than setting off alarm bells with me, you know, I thought that was just, you know, giving more status as a witness. But he said that at the time, he had gone to his superiors and said, look, these guys are being accused of murder. Shouldn't I come forward? Because I know this incident really happened. And he said that his superiors told him to stay out of it unless they were indicted. And since they were never indicted for murder, he had always regretted that he hadn't come forward, and he's coming forward now. So Paramount interviewed him, and they decided to give him polygraph tests. So they gave him 2 tests. The first test asked him about being in military intelligence, about seeing the craft and the beam, and he passed. A very high rating, you know. They gave him another test about having secret contact with class in his organization, and he flunked really badly. So, to me, that establishes again a connection between this UFO skeptics, military intelligence, and attempts to discredit the whole thing. And there's a whole litany of this continued harassment that Mike, the crew boss, has experienced. You know, federal criminal investigator coming in, flashing a badge, trying to, you know, comb through all of his contracting stuff and try to make it look as if there was some irregularity there, which there wasn't. But the guy wrote up a confession and tried to force Mike to sign it, and he refused. So the guy just took off real furious. Real huge guy, very intimidating, but Mike stood his ground and never signed any stupid confession. But we found out later that he had gone down to the sheriff and obtained copies of the entire file that the sheriff had on the UFO investigation, which to me, you know, suggests the real source of this federal investigation. But Mike reports that that kind of harassment has been going on even until, you know, I talked to him a few months ago and he said it was still going on. So, enough about that. When we went back to the site, right before the movie came out, we had difficulty locating the spot, and I thought it was because there was 4 feet of snow out there. Paramount insisted on getting there, so they rented these giant snowcats that they use at the ski run, and we went plowing over the snowdrifts, got everybody back there, you know, icicles hanging out of my mustache, and we did the interview on the site. That's the way these companies are, they've got to be on location, so we did. And we left. Well, I found out later that part of the difficulty in finding the spot is that the trees had changed. And only Mike realized that the trees nearest to where the craft had come down had suddenly grown much faster than they should. He went back in the spring and confirmed that indeed it had. He took a core sample, and this one in particular, and discovered that here was a tree, and you know, each ring in the tree accounts for 1 year of growth. And you can count back from the time of the interview in '92, 15 years, to the time of the incident. And you can see that there was a sudden jump in the thickness of these growth rings. And because the outer rings of a circle contain much more area than the inner, the geometric calculations showed that the tree was actually producing wood fiber at 36 times the rate it had in the previous. So this was a 100-year-old tree, and it was 85 years old at the time of the incident, and it doubled in diameter in the next 15 years. And you can see that although there's a little bit of variation in the growth rates during the 85 years, nothing like what happened after the incident. And when I went back to the site with National Geographic the year before last, for that stupid show, Chasing UFOs, we did uncover one very exciting piece of evidence there. At the site, there was a stump, a tree stump. See, I described coming into the clearing and seeing that logging debris. Well, the only logging that was done there was in 1974, the year immediately prior to the incident. So here was a large stump, a 200-year-old tree, and the growth rings, I'm going to make a slide for that, I don't have one, but I collected this in front of the National Geographic team, in front of their cameras, a growth ring sample from that tree, which demonstrated the same minimal kind of variation that you see in the 85-year part there. Minor variations, but basically proving that for 200 years, the stability of the growth conditions for trees on that hill had not changed in all that time, and there was nothing to equal what happened afterwards. There was actually a bit of a drought here and there during those years, so none of the growth conditions would really explain the sudden increase in growth. And this is kind of a breakdown on the geometry of how the amount of wood fiber increase was calculated. And this is ongoing research. The first slide there showed that after the forest fire came through there and killed these trees, the part of the tree that grew rapidly was more resistant to rot after it died. The tree on the left was a tiny sapling at the time of the incident, and so its inner growth was rapid, and then it kind of faded away, and normal growth ensued, and that's the part that rots. And then on the other one, it was of a certain age, and then the rapid growth came and then faded away, but only the rapid growth parts are the part that resist the rot. So I'm gathering samples, take to the lab, and ongoing research. We're going to go back and test to see if the radiation persisted. That was supposed to be done on the National Geographic expedition, and their insistence on doing it with 2 feet of snow out there is kind of like the Paramount trip out there. You cannot detect radiation through water; it blocks it. So that part was unable to be completed. Samples were taken on that expedition that were not turned into the lab. They're still with the scientist that came along, and she has possession of those samples. So that will still be followed through on. And nothing was done about the magnetic readings, and we'll do a follow-up on that. I really expect that probably the radiation and the magnetic readings will have returned to normal, but it needs to be checked. In the summer following the incident, a lady who works at the local newspaper was doing volunteer work on a fire watch tower near there. And she said a group of federal scientists came through that following spring doing magnetic mapping of the area. They had all these instruments for measuring magnetism on the ground. Now, the way this is normally done is they just have an instrument hanging on a long cable from underneath an airplane, and they can cover huge amounts of area. But, no telling what the purpose there was, but I suspect a connection to these unusual readings that were detected at the site. Coincidence, coincidence, coincidence. This right here was a topographical map, of the area, and it's divided the whole state up into about 75 different areas. But I went to look for the area where my incident happened, and it turned out to be Area 51. So I thought that was an amusing coincidence, or maybe a joke on the part of the map maker, that Area 51 would be the one where the incident happened, which also is, one of the least occupied, or, most empty sorts of most remote spaces on there. And then here's a picture of D.B. Sweeney on the left and my son on the right. My son came with me on a couple of outings, and people were saying, "Hey, you brought D.B. Sweeney with you." And I go, "What?" And then I realized, yeah, even though D.B. Sweeney was 8 years old at the time my son was born, here they are looking so much alike. He's just, it's astounding. Same blue eyes and hair and everything. So there was all kinds of coincidences. Robert Patrick, who played the crew boss, his birthday was on November 5th, the date that it happened. And he was 15 years old at the time that it happened, and here 15 years later he was playing the part. And it was just connection after connection. He dug in and found out that not only was he related to the man whose part he was playing, he was cousins on two sides of the family. He was double cousins to Mike. And I could just go on and on and on about all the coincidences that I could do a whole presentation just on coincidences. But at the time that it happened, there was a huge amount of turmoil. And what is portrayed in the movie is that the whole town was against us. But it was actually worse than that. Half the town was against us. The other half was for us. And so that pitted people against each other. And I give the example of the town marshal. He was a total skeptic about it, but his wife was more believing. However, his brother, who was one of the sheriff's deputies, was more believing, but his wife wasn't. So between these two brothers, they were on opposite sides of the fence, and between their spouses, they were on opposite sides of the fence. So it made for a lot of people being very reluctant to say what they really thought, or if they were interviewed on the street by the media, they'd say what they figured might play the best to the largest audience, that kind of thing. But since then, acceptance has grown dramatically. A lot of the misinformation that's out there, the evidence against it is gradually filtering out, and people are realizing more and more that a lot of the things that they were latching onto, certainly that I was not murdered, and the drug hallucination and all that kind of stuff, the contract theory, all that stuff was bogus. So, acceptance has grown and grown and grown as people look at the evidence. Plus, at the time that this happened, we didn't really know of a single planet outside of the solar system. Astronomers, believe that other stars probably did have planets going around them, but until, a Hubble telescope and Kepler, they didn't know for sure like they do now. This last year, NASA made a pronouncement that it's a virtual certainty that there are more planets in the Milky Way than there are stars. Just based on the sampling that they've done so far, every place they turn that telescope, they're finding that stars have planets going around them, and more than one. So they could deduce that there are more planets than stars, and we already know there's billions of stars in our galaxy. Granted, those other galaxies are so much farther away, but Stanton Friedman has displayed the mathematics that it's actually feasible with our technology to reach the nearest star in a single lifespan. So certainly, as Michio Kaku, he's been interviewed as a famous physicist, has been done a number of interviews where he stated, people keep assuming that these civilizations will probably be a few hundred years ahead of us. He says, but based on the ages of these star systems, they could easily be hundreds of thousands or millions of years ahead of us. I was talking to a young guy the other day here locally that was saying, well, would they have killed themselves off and gone extinct by then? I go, no, by then they would have learned how to survive, and even if their star died, they would by then learn how to move on and find another world. And the Kepler telescope has now identified dozens of planets that they call Earth-like, because they're in what's called the Goldilocks zone. Not too close to the sun, not too far away, and of a size that they would have a gravity that would permit life. So even if the tiniest fraction of these are life supporting, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of planets in the immediate neighborhood that have life. So all of this kind of knowledge that's gradually filtering out with people, back when this happened, we had a moon landing in '69 and not much, beyond that. But since then, shuttle flights became so routine that the world wasn't glued to the TV set when they launched. So, the whole idea is just people have become more accustomed to it, and acceptance has grown to the point where now my case is known worldwide, and there's more interest now than there ever was, in spite of the fact that there was that huge crush right when it happened, and then the huge crush surrounding the movie. It's partly the internet, and partly just a dawning awareness on the part of humanity that it'd be silly to think that we're alone. There's so much to talk about here. I'm not able to get into every little thing. There's some more research that we're going to proceed with on all these things. But I'd like to take a few questions if anybody's thank you very much.
You were a logger when all this happened. So what happened to your life after there? I mean, did you go on with your career in that area, or did it?
Well, after this happened, we basically lost our jobs because the crew didn't want to go back there. I was in no shape to go back, and some of the guys were just terrified to go back. Steve wouldn't even go out there during the search. He never helped out with the search. He was just pretty traumatized. And when my first book came out, I put in there that, he was one of the ones that was still crying when they went to the sheriff. And so when he read that, he was furious. He came over to my house and was ready to fight. That's a fight he would have lost, but I was telling him, look, you gotta let it go, man. There's no shame in that. It's not a measure of how tough these loggers were. It's about how overpowering what happened was. I said, I'll be the first to admit, that I was more scared than anyone. Mike was the leader, he was the boss, and he cried. So, but he's still got an issue with that to the point where he's trying to alter the story now, where he just thought it was cool when he saw me blasted through the air. He says 20 feet, and others say 10 feet, but he just said he thought it was cool that, and that everybody else was scared, but not him. But,
Question is a reference to your experience. Do you happen to remember if there was any specific insignia on the uniform?
No, there was no kind of insignia, no writing. But somebody pointed out to me here recently, what if they see in infrared or ultraviolet? What if they see in wavelengths that we don't? It might have been covered with symbols in different places that you just couldn't see because you see in a narrower spectrum.
Did you ever think or ever be checked out for the presence of the image there?
Yeah, the medical tests were very thorough, and there was upper body x-rays that didn't detect any kind of an implant. I got a call last year, and this guy was saying, well, that mark that was on your arm, you should take a really powerful magnet and put over that and see if you feel anything. So I went in there and got one, and I put it over there, and I didn't feel nothing. But I really don't think that mark had anything to do with the experience. I think it was probably just an injury that I got working in Thornbrush before the incident happened.
I have one question for you. Whenever you went out of the room to see 3D and you saw the other guy home, they look human, it's like human.
What's the last part?
They look human, it's like human.
Yeah, they look human. That's why I assumed they were human. Now, some people say, maybe the aliens or projecting some kind of a false image to give you confidence. And I suppose if they did that, I wouldn't be able to detect it. It's for the same reason when people say, well, do they look like robots? Maybe they whipped up some robots, were they, whirring and clanking and jerking them. I really don't think that it's some super advanced technology made a robot to stand in for a being that you would be able to detect it. It would function just as well or better than an organic being, so you're not going to see anything.
I was a little confused. Were there two types of beings?
Absolutely, two types of beings. You saw the pictures. Little people, now, see, they call them grays nowadays, but back then they didn't have that term. And I think that a lot of these reports are being lumped into one category. They just say those are grays. But I think that there's a similarity that makes people assume they're all one species and all from one place, when it's very possible that they can come from different planets and have no connection to each other at all.
But the last group appeared more like us.
Yeah, they look very, very human, and I assume they were human at first. It's not impossible they were from some Earth-based agency, but I really doubt that now.
Since the incident there, have you received any type of attempt to contact you since then?
Since then?
Since the initial contact?
Oh, well, I'm asked that question every single time I go out, and every single time I say, well, if I did, I wouldn't tell anybody, because, I also get the thing that, they compliment me for having the courage to come forward and, be on this, take up the crusade. But that's not really justified, because I tried to avoid the media. And since it was already worldwide news before I was returned, I was unable to keep quiet about it. And I found out that if I refused to do the interview, they'd go ahead and do the story, but it would be more negative than if I'd have just cooperated and were able to, dispel some of these false stories, point them in the right direction. Let them verify it for themselves, but if they don't even hear it, they're not going to know. So, one more question. What was that? You had a bunch of them.
Whenever you were on the bed, you said you had woken up, you had something more
Yeah, that thing that was across my chest, I'm assuming, was probably not just something where they were curious about my anatomy and were, I didn't put it in the category of an examination, but more likely diagnostic or treatment, something to do with being hit by that energy. One last thing, when the crew was passed their polygraph test, the president of the American Polygraph Association said, sure, polygraph is not 100%, but when you have, 6 people passing tests on a single issue, the odds would be over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any kind of mistake. And now, there have been 16 passed polygraph tests in connection with this incident. And I don't know what the odds would be now, but I've passed 5 different tests from 3 different examiners, all of those with extensive law enforcement experience. So, in spite of that, I don't consider the evidence that we have, although very, very strong, I don't consider it absolute proof. But very few things in our experience have absolute proof. You have things that are absolutely not true and absolutely true, but most things are somewhere in between. And we kind of have to assign a relative weight based on how much evidence there is for or against it. You can say something's unlikely to be true or pretty likely or whatever. You can even put it on a percentage scale. But skeptics are the people who say, if you can't prove it, that proves it's untrue. The same way the gullible person on the other end says, if you can't disprove it, then that means I can call it true. Well, neither one of those are valid, and one is no better than the other. So the skeptics are no better than somebody who says, if you can't prove it's not true, then I'll just say it is true. But I'm suspecting that we're running low on time here, so thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
We're extremely happy to have had Travis Walton as our featured speaker. And Travis, we hope to see you down the road in Del Rio. We're having a UFO festival in Del Rio, Texas in January, last weekend in January. And Travis also will be speaking to the folks down there along with a number of other very interesting speakers. So we invite you all down to Del Rio. I'd like to just mention before Brad closes us out that we've got quite a number of books. We thought we would run out of the Koyama incident, which is our new book, but we found a box full of them. So if anybody, we had to turn several people away. If you want some copies of Koyama incident, we found a box and we'll sell them for $10 over. My buddy Ruben is down there. And Travis, you still have a few copies of your book remaining over in the back corner. We appreciate everybody being here, and now I'll turn it over to our man in black, Brandon.
I'll tell you what, as fun as it was today, I lost some of that black. But anyway, thanks so much. You want to do it again next year?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I will relay that message to the powers that be, and we're already planning it, so. But anyway, I'm glad that some of my bosses showed up today, and I was very thrilled with the turnout. Tell your friends and neighbors about it, and we're gonna move it back a little bit closer to Halloween next year. So not this weekend, but say next weekend, a year from now. And it's going to get us a little bit closer to the Day of the Dead. And of course, I'll be working with Noe all throughout the year. If you have any suggestions, we're open to it. UFOborderzone.com. And I don't want you to forget that website address. Be sure to pick you up a T-shirt on the way out. And also, like I said, they've got some more copies of the latest book, and so please pick up on that as well. Anyway, thank you again. I'm glad you're on the road to Presidio. It's like no other place on earth. I wish you a safe trip home, and we'll see you down the trail.